While serving at a wedding, I suddenly spotted the groom. It was my husband, David. Seeing him with another woman, pretending to be someone else, sent my world crashing down. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life was turned upside down. Get a cup of coffee and settle down, because this story is inspiring from start to finish. Make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Oh, weddings. They always had a way of stirring up old memories, bringing me back to that day when David and I said our vows. Our wedding wasn't anything grand or over the top. Far from it, actually. We were just two young people in love, not concerned about fancy decorations or a big reception. Even now, after 7 years of marriage, those memories still brought a smile to my face. Working as a waitress for a catering company meant that I was always around weddings. Every time I walked into a beautifully decorated hall, the smell of fresh flowers in the air, I couldn't help but think back to our simple ceremony. If only I had known how fragile things could be. That day, just like any other, we arrived early to set everything up before the guests and the newlyweds showed up. About an hour later, the guests started arriving, their excited chatter filling the hall as they waited for the bride and groom to return from their photo session. I was in the restroom when Stacy, my colleague, burst in, her face pale with worry. "Lori, listen," Stacy said, her voice shaky. "I think you should go home." "Go home? Why would I do that?" I asked. "Are you trying to get more shifts for yourself?" "Sorry, but I need the money just as much as you do." Stacy shook her head, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. "No, Lori, you don't understand. I really think you shouldn't be here." "What are you talking about? Why are you acting so weird?" I said. "Stacy, seriously, what's going on?" She bit her lip, glancing toward the hall. "You're not going to like what you see." I headed back to the hall, my mind racing with thoughts of what Stacy had said. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the bride and groom. Stacy was right. I shouldn't have come. There, standing in front of all the guests, was David, my David, the man I had shared my life with for 7 years, now standing with another woman. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I turned and ran outside, tears streaming down my face. It was like a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. Outside, I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, my vision blurred with tears, but I forced myself to look at the sign with the bride and groom's names. "Welcome to the wedding of Kira and Richard." Richard? What a liar. Stacy rushed outside. She tried to speak, to comfort me, but I couldn't hear her. All I could think about was how he had betrayed me. I wiped my tears away, anger building inside me. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. No way. I was going to ruin this wedding and expose him for the fraud he was. I returned to the hall just as the bride and groom were giving their first toast. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew I had to do this. I marched straight up to David and snatched the microphone right out of his hand. He looked at me, his face full of shock and anger, but I didn't care. He deserved every bit of what was coming. "I have an announcement," I shouted into the microphone, my voice echoing through the hall. Every head turned toward me, the room falling into a stunned silence. The bride, this poor woman, clung to David like he was her lifeline. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, clearly not understanding what was happening. "David, or as you all know him, Richard, has deceived you all," I began, my voice trembling with rage. "He's already married. To me." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I could see the confusion and disbelief on their faces. "What?" the bride stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to David, her eyes filling with tears. "Richard, what's going on? Who is this woman?" David shook his head, his face a mask of feigned confusion. I don't know," he stammered. "I've never seen this woman in my life." 7 years of marriage. And you were blind? I shouted, feeling my anger boil over. What? What's 7 years of marriage? He asked, still trying to play dumb. Stop pretending you don't know me, I said. You're only making it worse, David. My name is Richard, he shouted back, his voice desperate. I have no idea who your David is. You're crazy. Oh, really? I said, narrowing my eyes. Then what's this? I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a picture of our wedding day. I held it up for everyone to see. The room fell into a deeper silence as people strained to get a look. The bride, Kira, stepped closer, her eyes locking onto the image. Richard, she asked, her voice trembling. How could you do this to me? How could you lie to me like this? And to her? She pointed at me, her hand shaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. Kira, Richard said, his voice softening as he reached for her. I swear, I don't know who this woman is or why she has a photo with me. I would never hurt you. But the bride shook her head, backing away from him. I loved you, Richard or David, or whoever you really are, she said, her voice breaking. How could you betray me like this? I don't even know who you are anymore. I'm Richard, he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. And I love you, Kira. I'm telling the truth. I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. He's probably only with you for your money, I said, the words dripping with contempt. Shut up, David yelled, his voice raw with anger and fear. The bride shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Richard, I can't do this. I can't be with someone who could lie like this, who could do something so awful. She turned to me. I'm sorry, she whispered. I really didn't know. It's not your fault, I replied, my voice softening. He deceived us both. Kira, please, David begged, but it was too late. She was already turning, running toward the door, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a broken dream. Without a second thought, David bolted after her. Kira, wait, he shouted as he disappeared through the doors after her, leaving the stunned guests and me standing there in silence. I stormed outside, ready to tell David I was done and filing for divorce. But when I found him, he was sitting on the curb, tears streaming down his face. Of course, play the drama, I said, crossing my arms. He looked up, his face twisted with anger. This is all your fault, he shouted. My wife ran away from me, and it's because of you. Some crazy waitress. I'm the crazy one? I yelled back. You're the one who married another woman while still being married to me. I'm not your husband. I've never seen you before in my life. Oh, really? I challenged, pulling out my phone. Then let's call David, who you claim you're not, and see what happens. Go ahead, call him, he snapped. I dialed David's number, putting it on speaker, but the phone just kept ringing. How strange that you're not picking up, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Then, suddenly the ringing stopped and I heard his voice. Yes, dear. Is everything okay? What the? I stammered, staring at the man in front of me. I told you I'm not your husband, he said, his voice calmer now, but still tense. Honey, I said into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady, I think you should come here. Something strange is going on. David arrived about half an hour later. For what felt like forever, he and Richard just stood there, staring at each other in complete silence. It was like looking into a mirror. They were identical in every way. Finally, Richard broke the silence, turning to me with a wry smile. Well, if I were in your shoes, I would have done the same, he said. David's eyes shifted to me, filled with hurt and confusion. How could you think I would do something like this to you? He asked quietly. He's your exact double, I blurted out, desperate to make him understand. Yes, David replied, his voice soft. But it still hurts that you thought that. I'm sorry, honey. I was just so angry and hurt, I said, reaching for his hand. As it turned out, Richard and David were both adopted from the same orphanage when they were just babies. But they were taken in by different families. They had no idea the other existed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband had a twin brother he never knew about. But that doesn't change the fact that my wife hates me, Richard said, his voice filled with despair. We'll fix that, I replied. Yes, get in my car, and let's go, David added, already moving toward the car. She'll never forgive me, Richard muttered. She will when she sees David, I assured him. We drove in silence to the hotel where Kira was likely staying. We went to her room, but she wouldn't let us in. I could hear her crying through the door, and it broke my heart. We didn't give up. We stood outside under her window, shouting up at her, trying to get her attention. Finally, she looked out the window, her eyes red from crying. I shouted, waving my arms to get her attention. Your fiancé didn't lie to you, and my husband didn't cheat on me. Look, I pointed to Richard and David, who stood side by side, identical in every way. Kira's eyes widened in shock. How is this possible? She shouted down at us. We were separated in the orphanage. Richard shouted back. For a moment, she just stared at us. Then she closed the window, and our hearts sank. See? I told you she wouldn't forgive me, Richard said, his voice heavy with defeat. But just as the words left his mouth, the door burst open, and Kira ran out, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Richard and kissed him, holding him tight. David pulled me into a hug. I'm sorry I doubted you, I said softly, looking up at him. David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Oh, I think I would have done the same. Honestly, I'm flattered that after 7 years of marriage, you're still willing to fight for me. I laughed, nudging him playfully before leaning in to kiss him. So, my husband gained a brother, and I gained a friend I can't imagine my life without.